That's all right. Take your time. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming this afternoon to help us with our inquiry. We are on live stream broadcast, so any conversation gets picked up and drowns out the one who's speaking. So just as the committee members, please refrain from any conversation amongst yourself. Before we start, it would be very helpful to get you on record. And from my left, if you don't mind introducing yourself and who you are, and if you wish to say who you represent, feel free to do so. If any of you want to make a short statement to start with, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll press on to the questions. So if I might start from my left, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Lorraine Turner. I'm the Technical and Business Development Director at the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UKAS. My responsibilities there include technical governance, development of accreditation of new areas, government engagement and stakeholder management. And I'm also a member of the Forensic Science Regulator's Forensic Science Advisory Council. I can give a short introduction to UKAS. Would it be helpful to do that now?
Well, if you're not already sent us in the written evidence, if you have, then we don't need it because we have it.
Okay. I think perhaps just to emphasise, UKAS accreditation attests the competence of organisations and their impartiality. So we carry out assessments against international standards, and I know those standards have been the topic of discussion in the committee, and we'd be happy to talk about those further. We've currently accredited over 60 or issued over 60 accreditation certificates in the area of forensic science. So it just gives you a bit of background.
Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Katherine Monnery. I'm the Forensic Accreditation Specialist at the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UKAS. I've worked at UKAS for over 22 years and been involved in the assessment of forensic science organisations for about 20 of those years. I'm a member of the Forensic Science Regulator's Quality Standards Specialist Group and Fingerprint Specialist Group, and also am a member of the National Police Chief Council Performance and Standards Group and National Quality Managers Group. I was also involved in the international committee that wrote ILAC G19. Thank you.
What was that?
ILAC G19. It's the document that we use alongside 17025 for the forensic context in terms of 17025 and 17020. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Sara Walton. I work in standards development for BSI, which is the UK's national standards body, and that entails stakeholder engagement and general development activities in the standards domain.
Good afternoon, I'm Steve Brunige and I'm Head of Industry and Government Engagement for the British Standards Institution. And my role is to raise awareness of the benefits of voluntary standards and the benefits that they bring to the UK economy. And I work extensively across government to raise awareness of how standards can be used to assist government in achieving policy objectives and as an alternative to regulation.
Okay, thank you very much. If I might kick off with the first question, it relates to about what your role is of your organizations in both standard setting and regulation in forensic science, and what standards, including how do you set the standards, including for ISOs, including, for instance, ISO 17025. How do you develop these standards, and what do you think are future challenges in terms of both developing standards and accreditation in view of the new forensic science that's developing?
Could I perhaps start? It probably makes more sense to start with, in terms of the process, to start with how we set standards first. At BSI, British Standards Institution, we are the national standards body for the UK. We operate under a Royal Charter and in accordance with an MOU with government, specifically with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And I'd just like to explain our process.
Did I hear you right? You deal with Department of Business, Energy, not the Home Office. No.
our sponsoring department within government is BEIS. So we work across government, but our relationship particularly is through BEIS. BEIS signed the MOU with us on behalf of government. So if I may just explain in general the process for how we develop standards, which is the same process that is used for forensic standards, and my colleague Sara can give a little bit more detail about the forensic standards. So essentially we facilitate the development of voluntary standards through committees made up of experts and a broad range of stakeholder groups. So these include industry associations, government regulators, academics, consumer and public interest groups, and BSI simply facilitates the process. So we bring together experts and we provide the process and the necessary support to enable the development of the standards. So these standards are essentially documents of good practice which are based on the principles of expert involvement, full stakeholder consultation and consensus building. Once finalised, we publish and communicate the standards, which are then reviewed at least every 5 years and either maintained, withdrawn or updated. As the UK's national standards body, BSI also represents a UK interest in international standards making. So we are a UK member of the international standards bodies, that's ISO, the International Organisation for Standardisation, and IEC, which is the electrotechnical equivalent, and also the European Standards Organisations, CEN and CENELEC. So we facilitate the involvement of UK experts into these groups to ensure that UK interests are fully represented.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else want to make any additional comments?
Only that is how the standards are developed for. So 17025 is developed in that way, and any of the and I know you've got extra questions about the other forensic standards. That is also developed in the same way. So we gather together the relevant and expert stakeholders and ensure that everybody has an opportunity to input into the development of standards.
Okay, Lord Hunt.
Thank you for your reply. You commented, Stephen Brunige, commented about every 5 years. I've been involved in wind engineering and the use of British standards. And there seems very little change every 5 years, despite research happening. And I just sort of wondered how rigorous the process of really seeing whether, because science is moving much faster in general than standards are. And I wonder whether you think this is a general feature, and how do you ensure that we really are pushing forward?
Well, we endeavour to keep up to date. The standards are required to update things at least every 5 years. So if there are developments quicker, then they will meet. They are, the committees meet regularly. In any case,
do they think of having a change in standards because of some accident happened, some sort of scandal, some sort of
No, it could just be because the experts or as you say, the science has moved on and something needs to change, and therefore that would be brought to the attention of committees, and people will consider whether or not something needs to change within a standard.
Well, I'm afraid to say, I wonder.
Did any of you wanted to come back? Any of the other two wanted to come back to my original question at all?
Yes, please. I think the role of UKAS, it mirrors in many ways the role of BSI, but our function is as the national accreditation body. So we too operate under a memorandum of understanding with government through BEIS as well. And it's that memorandum of understanding that outlines our role in terms of the standards that we use to assess and accredit organisations. So that is the reference point for that. So we use those standards, and in the case of forensic science, the standards that we use are ISO 17025 for the laboratory testing activities, and also ISO 17020, which is a standard for generically called for inspection bodies, but is used to assess the crime scene examination, the sort of front end of the forensic process. So we take those standards and we use technical experts to interpret and apply those criteria to evaluate and assess the competence of organisations. You asked about the challenges that we face. The challenges, they sort of fall into two camps. We have operational challenges and technical challenges. The technical challenges are around the interpretation and application of the standards. We utilise technical expertise to do that, both at the coalface when we're carrying out our assessments by using peers, and also in terms of the governance and management of the accreditation programme through our advisory council structure, committee structure. The operational challenges have been quite considerable in recent years because of the requirement for accreditation. The deadlines are set, and looking at the flow of work, the pipeline of work of private providers, police forces coming forward for accreditation. But they're challenges that we manage well, and we work with stakeholders in order to be able to get the engagement and support to deliver the accreditation.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Manningham-Buller.
That moves on to really what the experience of the people seeking accreditation is. Now, you said at the beginning in your opening remarks that you're there to decide on competence, but also on impartiality. How do the people who are seeking accreditation from you give you that assurance? What's the process?
The process is one where they need to demonstrate that competence. So that is through the format of an assessment, which covers looking at their documentation, their policies and processes, the principles that they have in place in their organisation. And then our assessment includes the witnessing of activities. So we look at the tests that they perform, the samples they take. So
you go into the labs.
We go into the laboratories, and we go on site as well, where there's site activities. So we actually witness the evaluation activities that they are conducting, and we look at records. So we look at evidence that they have followed their systems and processes in the past. We look at the management controls that they have in place to ensure sustainability of the application of those principles and policies and processes in future.
And you haven't touched yet on you've been largely talking about the competence component. What about the impartial component? How do you judge that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take... particularly in relation to the forensic aspects, we'd be looking at impartiality in terms of perhaps the hypotheses that people were putting forward in terms of what they were looking at in what they were given to examine, and how they were looking at what they were given to examine in terms of a prosecution bias perhaps, or something that they were looking for in terms of an alternative hypothesis to what had been presented to them. So we're looking at their weighing up the evidence rather than taking a particular view depending on whether someone had come and been the customer in that regard.
And you choose which samples to look at?
Yes, during the witnessing.
Rather than wait for what they give you?
Absolutely. So we would perhaps ask for some to be prepared in advance if we were wanting to see particular records of particular activities. But we would also then take the opportunity to see what was going on during the laboratory work or at the crime scene, whatever it be, that we would look to see just general work going through the process. We also review a lot of case records, so we would go back over cases that had been completed, which we would select at random.
Thank you. Just one final question. We've had some evidence that this is quite an overhead for small providers of forensic services. Do you have any way of mitigating the costs for them so they're not driven out of the business?
We have been doing some work on that.
Yes, we do. Our costs, the costs, there's two elements to the costs for an organisation to go through the accreditation process. One is the cost of implementing the improvements to address any gaps that they have in their system. And those costs are sort of not really the things that are within our control, because they are the measures that they put in place before they come forward for accreditation, or certainly before they're granted accreditation. In terms of the fees that they pay to us to cover the cost of conducting the assessment, we are very mindful of the impact that has on small businesses. We've been working with the Forensic Science Regulator and the Chartered Society of Forensic Science to look at ways in which we can reduce the amount of time it takes to conduct the assessment. So where there are efficiencies that we can build in. So one example of that is where the Chartered Society is putting in place a set of sort of standard documentation that the small businesses can then adopt and we only need to assess that documentation once, and that can bring about a reduction in the amount of time it takes to conduct the assessment.
You mentioned inspections. Are these planned inspections, or do you do unannounced inspections?
We can do both, really. We have a programme of visits that we would conduct to an organisation. So generally we would visit each organisation once it's accredited annually. But we can make the decision to make that more frequent, or we can do it in response to a quality incident or a complaint, or we can undertake unannounced visits as well if we feel that would be necessary.
And how many of these unannounced inspections do you do on average?
I did one not that long ago, actually, in response to a quality incident. So we don't do them very frequently. I would say it's not a routine, but in response to issues we can do. We did do some work about probably 3 or 4 years ago where we actually did routine unannounced visits just to give ourselves confidence in what was being undertaken in the forensic science area, and we found actually that went very well. People actually embraced it quite well, and it didn't raise any significant concerns that we needed to take forward any further.
So it's the processes that you inspect, correct? It's the processes of the providers who provide the service, not individuals working in them.
We look at the competence of the service as a whole,
yes.
But that inevitably means that we will look at the competence of individuals, and we will look at the systems and processes that the organisation has in place to assure and maintain the competence of individuals. So they need to have a system where they've got evidence that somebody's had the appropriate training, has the right knowledge and experience to perform the duties that are assigned to them. And then we look at objective evidence of that. So we will sample. We won't necessarily look at every member of staff. We will sample across the different types of activities, and we will look at their competence in different ways. So we don't attest the competence of individuals, but it's the sum of the parts within that organisation.
Okay. Lord Griffiths.
We get at the question of how tough for you or how difficult it is to pass accreditation. I mean, when you go to, say, a company and you have certain standards and so on, how often would you typically say, first-class organisation, we have no comment? How often would you say, there are certain remedial actions that need to be taken? How often would you say, I'm afraid we cannot accredit you? Okay. I mean, if you had categories like that, what would be the results over the last few years, for example, of what you've done?
I think it would be very rare that we conduct an assessment of an organisation that's not accredited and not find identify any non-conformities. So there will pretty much always be non-conformities. Hopefully, if we've done the sort of preparation with them, they've had a pre-assessment and they've taken on board the comments that have been picked up then initial assessments should be successful, but with a number of things, hopefully a minor in nature. Sometimes we need to conduct further assessment activities. I think across the board in UKAS, the proportion of those that don't succeed first time, I would think, is probably less than probably 10 or 20%. We have seen in the area of some of the new activities in forensics a higher number of revisits because the organisations are maybe not as prepared in some cases as they might be. And I think that's one of the keys when we were talking about this, how do we keep the costs down. The better prepared the organisation to come forward, the more likely they'll be successful first time. But I think that typically we don't see that many cases where we conduct an initial assessment and can't make any recommendation at all that doesn't sort of relate to follow-on work. It would probably be a matter of quite a catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
Lord Hunt, are you wanting to come?
You used the word quality incident. I mean, my question was sort of I was thinking about this, is do you look at trials afterwards when there were two very different cases, and does the science, as it were, scientific or technical questions emerge from that, and you use that data?
We would look more, there's two sort of things there. Quality incident, we're meaning something a little bit different, but we would ask the organisation certainly to review any work that's gone through the courts, and if there has been significant challenge, to raise that as non-conforming work within their systems themselves, and that then would form part of our assessments to look at.
In the case I was an expert witness, and it was palpable that the science being used was extremely old-fashioned and wrong, and so that's what I would have thought as a quality incident.
Absolutely, yes.
And I suspect these developments are happening more rapidly than every 5 years. That was my...
Yeah, and I think we would expect organisations to be very cognizant of if they've had any judicial comment made that's negative, or anything has happened in the courtroom that's negative, that they take that into their system and effectively deal with that as a complaint and put it through a non-conforming work process to raise issues, investigate and take some corrective action. We certainly would look at that. I mean, we're also seeing what's happening in the court, so if we see something from an accredited organisation, we would expect some action to have been taken. Quality incidents as well can take very many different forms, so it may be something along these lines, but it could be something, a contamination incident, or something where some erroneous method has been used, a piece of equipment has gone outside of calibration, and therefore the results generated by that might have some doubt cast on them. We expect people to take cognizance of that and to do something about it, investigate and take some corrective action. Also, to inform us. That's a very important part of accreditation as well, that if something comes to light in an organisation that is accredited, that we would expect them to alert us to that straight away, so we can also review that and make sure that we're involved in seeing the investigation and the corrective action that's taken place.
Lord Thomas.
What external steps do you take where expert witnesses are from time to time dishonest, they colour the evidence, they're unreliable? How do you check on this externally to ensure that the individuals are actually fit and proper to be doing their tasks within each of the bodies you accredit?
Well, we will look at the staff within that organisation.
No, but do you go to outside people and ask, or do you rely purely internally on what you're told?
Looking deeply into their eyes.
We would look at the evidence that they have, the body of evidence that they have, and that needs to be more than just a statement from the organisation. So that would be the professional qualifications they hold, the participation in activities that quality assurance activities within the organisation that might be set externally, proficiency testing, external quality assurance measures. The individual experts, when they're giving evidence in court, is not part of the assessment and accreditation process currently. The Forensic Science Regulator is working on an appendix to the codes to elaborate the requirements so that can be included. But currently, the process takes us up until the point where they issue the report. So their performance in court is not included in our assessments.
So their ability to explain forensic science to the jury, to take a very basic level of competence, is not assessed, nor is their integrity.
Well, I think that one of the requirements within the Forensic Science Regulator's Codes of Practice is exactly the ability to give evidence, in the sense of trying to explain to a jury, or in layman's terms, the science that they're using, and make sure that would be possible. And we test that out during our visits by sitting down with people and saying, so explain to me, what is this that you've done? How did it work? Asking the questions that might come out in a courtroom from somebody who's unfamiliar with the evidence itself or the science behind it.
But do you go to the courts and ask them what this person is like, or test an organisation? So you have some...
Sounds as though you've had some experience, Lord Thomas.
Indeed, a lot of experience of bad experts. And I just wondered how you got them out of the system. That was my question.
I mean, I think currently we don't cover that aspect.
Where there is feedback within the service itself. So if we look at the complaints and any judicial feedback that they've received during the process, to make sure that is picked up and addressed. But actually looking at the performance in court, no, it's not currently covered.
I mean, also within UKAS, anybody can come to us with any feedback about any accredited organisation, and we take that very seriously as well in terms of following that up, and that might come to be a quality incident if we receive some feedback in relation to experts from an organisation that holds accreditation. We would follow that through.
Thank you.
Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to try and clarify this point, both the questions from the earlier one from Baroness Manningham-Buller and also just now from Lord Thomas. in your written evidence, you did talk about how organisations do get accredited in respect of the competence of the people reporting and interpreting the evidence. So it's very closely linked to what we've just been talking about.
Yes.
So how can you say a bit more about that? Because you talked about further requirements being necessary there. Can you explain what that means? In other words, how do you actually accredit how good somebody is going to be at actually doing exactly what Lord Thomas has been talking about, of being in court? The test results are taken as given, but the way they're explained, the way they're interpreted, how do you actually accredit that person?
I think it's probably important just to clarify what we currently accredit in relation to opinions and interpretations. It's part of the 17025 standard to be able to make opinions and interpretations based on the test results. So an example would be, currently we're doing a lot of work with the fingerprint comparison bureaus, and that would be an example where the test itself, if you like, is to review a known mark and an unknown mark and look for similarities. The opinion would then be to say that given that information, is it likely to be Katherine Monnery's fingerprint? So you're drawing upon expertise of working in that field to make that sort of above and beyond the test result, the inference and the opinion around that. So that's the kind of opinion interpretation we currently would accredit. So it's the direct interpretation of the test result. What we currently don't accredit is, as Lorraine was explaining, the expert opinion then given in court, which might be, I think you've heard the term source and activity previously, so we might be looking at a source level approach to things. So that's just to say it was Katherine Monnery's fingerprint. How it got there, the activity, is something else again, and that's the opinion that's often given in court, the expert opinion given in court, and that currently wouldn't be part of the accreditation process. But in relation to the opinions and interpretations element that we do look at, we look at quite a number of other parts, as we said. So the qualifications, the experience, etc. But also the knowledge, a little bit around the edges of the science and the technology, so how things work and operate, and ask lots of questions around that during sort of interviews, during the assessments themselves. Look at the impact of variables, the uncertainty of measurement, look at limitations of a technique, and that's obviously quite important in some areas to understand that. And also perhaps legal requirements like the criminal procedure rules or the practice direction, and make sure people are aware of their responsibilities in terms of being experts going forward into the courtrooms.
So when an organisation comes to you to be accredited or to have its accreditation renewed, you are looking at the various test procedures they do. That I think is clear. But do they actually submit the individuals working for the organisation, the types of people that might well be experts in court?
We would look at that, not necessarily during the application process, they wouldn't define those, but during the assessments we would ask to see organisational structures, who was working in different areas within an organisation, look to see the role descriptions, the job descriptions of the people within it, any person specifications to do with qualifications or experience that will be determined for each of the different roles that might be in the forensic organisation. We'd see that they had staff fulfilling those roles and that those staff had the requisite qualifications and experience and had been trained and had the competency demonstrated through objective mechanisms, and that would be part of our assessment.
And so the result of the accreditation is that certain people within the organisation are given some kind of rating or
No, it would be the organisation that held the accreditation, and the staff would be not the people themselves. So it's not transferable in a sense. If somebody were to leave an organisation, they don't take that accreditation with them per se because they've been assessed under that organisation. It's the organisation and their ability to maintain the competence of the staff within it.
Now, whilst I need to... Lord Fox first, then Lord Griffiths.
Yeah, the converse of that question is how many of the staff would have to leave before they lost the accreditation?
Well, we would look at that. We'd look at resources.
How would you know?
Well, one of the things that the organisations need to inform us is significant changes to their organisation, and that may well be loss of staff, for an example.
But what is significant in that context?
If they weren't able, therefore, to deliver the services for which they had the contracts.
But if you switch someone out, you can still do the service, but it's an entirely different suite of individuals or people. I mean, they may still be using the same process which you've accredited, but it's different people.
But if it's a significant person, so if the accreditation is incumbent upon the knowledge of that person, and that's perhaps a technical manager or a significant person, if that person were to leave, we would need to be informed. So we wouldn't need to know every staff movement if it was at the analyst level or just people coming and going as natural would happen in any organisation.
And that happens, does it?
People come and go in any organisation.
But do you get companies informing you that
absolutely,
this is happening?
Absolutely. And that might prompt us to then consider whether we need to do an extra visit to go and see whether if there's another member of staff being brought in, do they have the requisite experience and qualifications to continue with that role. But it might not be specific people, it could be numbers of people. If there were to be numbers of people leave, it might not be able to continue with that service.
Now, whilst I need to move on, you created a lot of excitement.
Okay.
So I got Lord Griffiths, followed by Baroness Morgan, followed by Lord Borick, and followed by Baroness Young.
Okay.
So answers need to be exactly to the question.
Okay.
Lord Griffiths.
Of the organisations which you investigate, review, what percentage are public sector organisations, like police? What percentage are private sector organisations, like, say, private companies?
Within the forensic
Yes,
sector?
just within forensic.
We have some numbers, but I'm not sure we've got those exact numbers. We could provide you with those.
Can I say, the second question would have been, are there notable differences between commercial organisations and non-commercial organisations in the problems that they throw up to you? Or the questions that maybe they...
I think it's hard to make a sort of a sweeping differentiation between the two. I think what we've, in the private sector providers, the large private sector providers that have been accredited, or we've been assessing them for many years. So we've got a lot of history, we've got a lot of information about their performance. So the police forces, not all of them by any means, because the Metropolitan Police, for example, has been accredited for a long time. Some of the newer organisations, we're still in that process of building up that information. So there are different challenges for the public sector and different challenges for the private sector as well. If you want to add to that.
No. Lord Griffiths, do you want to come back to that?
Well, I mean, I'm very used to regulation within the financial sector. And to take a point Lord Thomas made, there are bad apples in organisations. And when they're discovered, I mean, you find that they may have done a lot of damage. Whether the same would be true in a public sector organisation, I don't know. I suspect I mean, my hunch would be that if you're looking at private sector organisations, you need to have somehow a more intense supervision than if you were looking at a public sector organisation. That may be totally wrong, but certainly...
I think there are challenges for both, and I think it would be wrong to sort of say one had different challenges in this regard than another. I think there are challenges from budgetary constraints in both sectors, and I think that is possibly where people feel pressured to make wrong decisions, and I think that is common in both areas currently.
So, go slightly tangentially, without mentioning the court case going through just now, or the organisations involved, would your processing would have picked up the accreditation processes, the problem that occurred? I think you know what I'm referring to.
Okay, yes. If we talk in general terms, there is a mechanism that we have in place with all the forensic laboratories where they are required to report to us any significant quality incident. That's a requirement of accreditation. So any organisation identifying major issues, deviations from its processes are required to report those as quality incidents. In fact, probably interestingly, we tend to get a greater number of quality incidents reported from the organisations that have been involved in accreditation for the longest, because I think they're used to identifying issues and reporting and repairing those issues. The particular case that you're talking about, I think if we look at it just in general, where there are significant incidents reported, we have to investigate, we have to understand the issue. I think if they're in cases where there are skilled individuals that are intent to conduct a criminal activity or activity which is not appropriate, and they're very clever in covering that up, I think it's less likely that the internal systems within the organisation or our assessments will pick that up. The key thing from all our quality incidents that get reported is we learn from them. We look to say, is this something that needs more scrutiny? Is this something that needs a different emphasis? Because our assessments are a sampling exercise. Okay. We're in on site for 1, 2, 3 days, depending on the scope of the organisation. So, you cannot look at everything all the time. So you're relying on their systems being in place and maintaining the performance.
Okay. Baroness Morgan.
A quick one. First, well, 2 tiny ones actually. Firstly, is there some sort of process of whistleblowing? So, do individuals in an organisation have the capacity to go directly to you? And secondly, do you have some sort of? You talked a lot about people would be required. They'd know that they had to tell you things. Where are they told? Is there a pro forma? I mean, and if so, could we have it in a sense so that we understand exactly what is required of organisations?
Yes, we can certainly cite the relevant requirements that they're required to follow. And of course, if we identify that they haven't told us something that they should have told us, there are sanctions that can apply.
Okay.
Whistleblowing?
Whistleblowing, yes. Anyone can come to us about any of our accredited organisations with information, and we will investigate it.
Do they?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Lord Borwick.
The process which you described seems fairly similar to the process used in many other industries for regulating the people in their industry. I'm thinking of CAA for pilots and FCA for financial services. Is there a metric by which one can judge the efficiency of the regulator? In other words, how much does it cost you to accredit somebody working in the forensic science in comparison with similar accreditation in other industries? Are you more efficient than the CAA? How would you compare yourself with the FCA?
We're not the regulator. Obviously,
I appreciate that,
the forensic science,
the process is similar.
Yes, we haven't done benchmarking specifically our role against a regulator perhaps because we're not a regulator, but what I can say is that accreditation is used by other regulators as a mechanism to demonstrate competence and support the regulation, and I think the metrics, the costs will be similar because our pricing model is common across the organisations that we assess and accredit. Maybe the economics are different in the organisations depending on their size and their scope of business. So, as has already been identified, we are aware that the costs might be higher in terms of proportion of turnover for a small organisation compared to a larger one.
Okay, Baroness Young and then Lord Hunt.
One of the things we heard by way of criticism of some of the organisations was that they were strapped for cash and therefore slow. Do you look at the whole issue of pace and timiousness in your accreditation?
Do you mean in terms of delivering their service? Yes, we do, because there are requirements in the standards in relation to the meeting their customers' requirements. We will, whilst the criteria for accreditation doesn't specify particular timescales, they would come from the contract and the delivery of service. So if we identify that those criteria or those timescales or KPIs are not being met, we will report on that. But it's not the standard itself doesn't define what those timescales should be. So we will then look at a number of measures within the organisation. So what the contracts require, are they delivering? Have they had any feedback, positive, negative, in terms of what they're actually delivering to their customers?
And if you find failure on a sufficient number or any parameters, you talked about sanctions. Do you apply the sanctions, or does the regulator apply the sanctions?
We apply sanctions in relation to accreditation. So at the very basic level, that would be a non-conformity, which might not alter initially their status of accreditation, but require them to carry out some corrective action. But we can also apply sanctions to the organisation by suspending either part of the scope of activities from their accreditation. So if there's a problem with a particular test or group of activities, that can be removed. We can suspend accreditation for the whole organisation if we identify significant failures. Then the regulator will be informed of those sanctions that have been imposed, but we're not sort of imposing those sanctions on behalf of the regulator. It's in relation to their accreditation and their accreditation status.
Lord Hunt.
I'd like to ask this question here, which says how closely do you work with the Forensic Science Regulator in setting standards and awarding accreditation? But I'd like to sort of connect to that the role of working with the science organisations, I mean, EPSRC and so on, and the other research councils. Do they, as it were, connect to the Forensic Science Regulator, or do they set up research projects that are of interest to you in UKAS? I just haven't. Later this afternoon we'll be talking about others, but I wondered. In none of our questions do we have this specific point made. How do we connect to the whole scientific infrastructure?
We don't have a direct relationship with the sort of the science research councils, apart from where on our advisory group and tapping into the various groups that the Forensic Science Regulator has on the different disciplines, subject areas, where we would connect with those scientists.
But when you apply for a research grant, you have to sort of endlessly say how this work is going to be applied. So presumably there must be, therefore surely the research councils, they're reading these documents, all of which say application, application, application. Does that not include application to forensic science?
Our role is primarily with assessing and accrediting the forensic science providers who are carrying out routine testing. So the scope of their accreditation relates to their sort of repertoire of tests. They may also conduct research, and if that research relies on testing as part of that, then we that may fall within their scope of accreditation. But we're not specifically looking at their research activities across the whole.
But doesn't it help your work?
It helps our work to be connected with the developing technologies, and that tends to get presented to us when an organisation comes forward using that technology or that new methodology as part of their routine work.
So the role of these private sector companies, for example, is quite important then in transmitting science from the research world to the application world. Is that right? That seems to be what you're saying.
They would apply the science, I think, and then they would come to us to sort of accredit that activity that might be novel and innovative and might be a new area of science or a new application of science, and they'd come to us to ask for the accreditation.
Evidence from one of our previous sessions was 150 research programs of the research councils were all to do with forensic science, and application of forensic science. You sound a bit diffident, if I may say so. She was very gung-ho about all this application, which was working.
I think it's our role in the process comes later on. Yeah. So once the new technology is being developed, whether that's in private or in academia, and it gets deployed as sort of routine activity, then we look at the body of evidence that demonstrates that technique or that process is valid and fit for purpose.
So how does a regulator involved in your work? That was the original question.
The regulator, we work closely with the regulator. Obviously, she's a key stakeholder in the delivery of accreditation in this area. The regulator doesn't have any role in making any decisions on accreditation. So, but the various committees and groups that she facilitates, and our own advisory group that sort of helps us steer our activities.
So as accreditation bodies, who are you accountable to?
We're accountable to a number of different organisations, and in the first instance through to government, through the Memorandum of Understanding that we have with Department for Business, Energy and Industrial
And how
Strategy.
do they hold you to account?
They monitor our activities through a number of different mechanisms. They participate in our Policy Advisory Council and forum, so they're very well connected to know what's going on. We are monitored and evaluated as an organisation by our peers within the international infrastructure of accreditation. We're a member of the European Cooperation for Accreditation, and that facilitates mutual recognition of accreditation between countries in Europe through EA and also globally through the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation.
But that's not accountability, really, is it?
Well, we have to
You have an association, but not accountability.
We have to demonstrate we're peer evaluated against an international standard, so we have to demonstrate that we have robust, independent, impartial processes. We have external stakeholder groups which provide advice into us. So we're accountable also to our members, our member organisations, because that's although we're a private company, we're a company limited by guarantee, and our members include government departments, associations of laboratories, and so on.
Okay, Lord Fox.
So I should probably have asked this question before, but how much of forensic evidence being used in court is accredited, and how much is not accredited?
I don't think we would have figures.
Yeah, but roughly, is it 50-50? Is it only a tiny percentage that isn't accredited? What is the broad bulk of the answer to that question?
I suppose the question would be relating to if it was scientific testing or examinations undertaken in laboratories. I think you've heard from the main forensic providers hold a large amount of accreditation, so any work going through those providers would most likely be covered by their accreditation. I think where we find that is less so, it's obviously companies who haven't come to us for accreditation. I know there's been a lot of talk about digital organisations. There will be digital organisations that aren't accredited and therefore presenting evidence in court.
And in your experience, how often is the court aware that the evidence is either accredited or not accredited?
I think that's something that's becoming more evident and is being asked more frequently now. I think if we went back probably 5 years, it would not have been a question ever asked, potentially. But nowadays, I think with the role of the Forensic Science Regulator, with the deadlines for accreditation, it's being asked much more frequently. In fact, now people are needing, as part of the Forensic Science Regulator's codes of practice...
What assessment do you make of the evidence given from people who are not accredited?
We don't. We don't, because that's our role is to conduct the assessments and accreditation of the organisations that come through our door. I think it's the goal of the Forensic Science Regulator to have a significant proportion of the scientific evidence, and the statement of requirements has picked off. So it's picked off the different evidence types and the different activities.
So do you have a view whether the evidence presented to the court should only be from accredited organisations?
I suppose coming from an accreditation body, we would always sort of respond to that, quite positively.
Yeah, but you have to back it up. Why?
It's not really a decision, though, for us. I think it's a decision for those who use that information as to whether those quality standards are the right standards to be used for that context. But of course, we would support that information from accredited organisations is a good thing.
Quick questions and brief answers. Baroness Young and then Lord Fox.
So, if in fact, whether you're accredited or not when you appear in court is pretty random, do the sanctions work at all of not being accredited?
Well, the sanctions that we apply are only applied to those organisations within our system. So with the aim...
if you were to remove accreditation, how much damage would that cause to, for example, a police in-house service?
Well, we would publish the fact that an organisation had a sanction applied. So,
but it wouldn't prevent them from presenting information.
It wouldn't.
in court.
But currently, as I was saying, the codes of practice require people to declare compliance or non-compliance with the statement of requirement in the regulator's codes of practice. So they would have to, if they had been declaring compliance previously, they would have to declare non-compliance with the codes of practice, and therefore that may result in questions being asked about the credibility of the evidence that they're putting forward.
Lord Fox.
The Lord Chairman asked you, should all evidence givers be accredited? And you said it wasn't for you to say, but I think it is for you to say what your limitations are. So are you equally good at certifying a large organisation with lots of scientific process as you are a sole trader who does, let's say, archaeological forensic something or other? Do you cover the full spectrum, or are you much more likely to be useful for that big organisation with lots of sort of scientific process?
I think the opportunities for accreditation to be developed in other areas of forensic science, in addition to those where we're already working, are there, and there is scope for us to do that where there is the demand.
So you're saying you don't have limitations?
So I wouldn't say there aren't any limitations at all. We would come back to, is it something that is accreditable? Is it something that can be seen as an objective, repeatable activity?
A method, yes, understood.
Okay, Lord Fox, would you like to take your question?
Yeah, turning to the silent partners at the end of the table. Just when you thought you had enough standards, BS ISO 21043 or something is creeping up. I understand that you're working on some other standards. I mean, the question, first of all, is why? What are you seeking to do? Are you merely offering a competitor's standard, or are you filling a hole that exists? What is that hole? How did you understand that hole? In other words, how did you develop the scope of what you're doing, and with whom did you work on that scope?
Well, those standards are being developed in the international standards organisation space. So the UK is inputting expert information and expert content into those standards. They're quite new standards, and they're process standards. So they're standards which are designed to support people who are in this area.
So they don't supersede 17025.
They do not supersede it at all. No, they would, if anything, they would maybe support what was going on in 17025, but they are not designed to do anything other than support that.
So you'll have to help me, because I'm not a standards expert. So what on earth are you seeking to do?
Well, we are not. We ourselves are not seeking to do anything, because we, as the standards body, we facilitate everybody who needs to get involved.
So a group of people get in a room and decide they want a new standard, but why do they decide
they decide they want a new standard based on they have to be market relevant, there has to be a need for them, there has to be within the stakeholder community, which includes governments, regulators, industry, public interest groups, that there should be something in that space that would help people.
I'm sorry, I am struggling. Is what are you seeking to cause to happen? In other words, what are you making better? I understand, is it measuring
hydrochloric acid better, or is it
what is it doing?
It's guidance. So I could so let me just sort of read you the scope of one of those. So the forensic sciences in part terms and definitions. So basically, what language are people using? It's about supporting the consistency and repeatability of any activity in this space.
So a taxonomy, if you like.
So taxonomy, and then recognition, recording, collecting, transport and storage of material is another one, and specification for consumables being used.
Because I thought that was already being done in the other ones.
No, the 17025 is a different type of standard. It's requirements for the organisation, as it's been described here. And that is accredited. That organisation is accredited to that standard, which is different from forensic sciences processes, as in this case.
Can you say something about the relationship with the European Standards Organisation, CEM?
Very briefly, what is it?
I mean, how do they?
It's a similar Relationship, we are a member of BSI, as the UK standards body, is a member of CEN and CENELEC, which are the European organisations. These standards that we've just discussed are actually they are international standards. They are not being necessarily adopted within the European space.
So the driver for updating a standard comes mainly from
it comes from
within
the European space. So it could come from another country member of ISO.
And does that happen in forensic science?
It does happen, yes. It happens in all areas that another country of one of the 165 country members of ISO may decide that their organisational capability within their country needs support, and they may then propose something. And for example, we have quite a mature system in this country, as you've heard, around accreditation of forensic science and laboratories carrying out those tests. But maybe in other countries around the world that is not the case. So whether or not these standards may exist, whether or not they are then adopted and used within the UK. These have been adopted in the UK, but how much they are used, but they are supposed to be guidance and suggested help for processes within an organisation.
Are there any countries that are prominent in forensic science that are actually leaders influencing?
Well, I think we're pretty prominent within the apart from the UK. I couldn't really say exactly. Would you know of any particular? Is it Germany is quite
in the standards area? I think Australia would be someone who would be quite proactive in that sort of vicinity. Other European countries.
Yeah. Australia, in fact, runs the international committee for standards in forensic science.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah, just you didn't kind of help me on the stakeholders. So I'll pitch the question in a slightly different way. How did you go about deciding that you were going to get involved in this standard? Did you have a meeting and say, people come up to you and say, we desperately need this standard? Or did you think, we're a business and we need a product, and we haven't got a product in this area, so why don't we do this? So if it's the former, who came up to you and what were they asking for?
Well, this would have, as I say, taken place in the international community, so I'm not entirely sure. We'd have to check who it was that had proposed the standards that we just talked about.
I'm kind of trying to work out what the demand is for this.
Yes, so exactly. So there would be demand from, as I say, there could be demand from the industries or the regulators in other countries.
What the process was for deciding to do this.
Yes, we can certainly give you some background on those standards.
Dennis Morgan.
Can I ask about ISO compliance with ISO standards? We've had evidence that compliance at the moment is quite low amongst some disciplines. Particularly, we heard about digital forensic and fingerprints. And I mean, it was fingerprints I was most interested in, because I think the quality standard was set in 2014, and here we are past the deadline. And our understanding is that quite a lot of organisations have not yet become compliant. Why? What's going on? Why has that happened?
I think there's been a number of reasons. I think the driver now has been really the secondary legislation has come into play. So I think that's focused a lot of minds in progression to take things forward. So we've seen a lot of really good progress, I have to say, in the last 6 months or so in relation to fingerprint comparison, and it's moving in the right direction in terms of compliance. I think the first issue is, if organisations don't come to us to ask for extensions to scope for particular areas, obviously we can't take them forward. So there was a delay perhaps in some of those organisations coming forward. When they do come forward, I think then when we've done work with them in the preliminary stages, it identified that there was a number of significant gaps in what they were doing in terms of meeting the requirements for the standards. So things like validation was one of the things that was quite an area where a lot of people had to do a lot of work in meeting the requirements of the standard. And that's quite an extensive area to look at, because people need to decide what they're going to validate, and then they need to develop the ground truth databases to have the artifacts to be able to put through the validation to demonstrate that the methods are appropriate. So having identified that there's a gap, there's still a lot of work to be done to get it to a position where it's compliant with the standards. And that's taken a bit of time to do. But people now, I think, are in a position where that's happening, and we're seeing much more positivity in the assessments that we're undertaking and the outcomes from those assessments going forwards. So it's looking better. But I think there's a number of learning points perhaps with that area that could be taken forward into other areas going forwards to meet other deadlines. We particularly, from a UKAS perspective, took a bit of an innovative, novel approach to adopting slots for accreditation, as it were, in the preceding year, running up to the deadline, to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to have an assessment in time to be compliant with the deadline. So we took that approach. Not everybody took us up on those slots or were prepared sufficiently to be ready for the assessments at that slot. So I think that's something that the community needs to sort of take on board.
So what you're really saying that until there was a looming deadline, although it was set 4 years ago, until there was a looming deadline, nobody did anything really, and so you've had it all in the last 6 months.
I think that focused the minds of people to have a particularly secondary legislation coming in. The regulator's deadline was always there, as you mentioned, but I think there was then the prospect of the legislation coming in. Taking the converse as well in terms of digital forensics, the regulator's deadline has passed, but we haven't seen that pick up because I don't think there is that requirement still to be accredited.
As long as they can keep
So they can still be used. So does that suggest that you really haven't got much muscle? Because in a sense, if frankly the deadline passes and they're not too disturbed about it, does that mean really that they don't really feel that it matters hugely to them?
I think as the services and as the whole system has become more aware of the requirements, and there is a need to disclose where if accreditation is required by the regulator and not held, I think that in itself will also focus the minds, because to continually have to report that this work is not covered under their accreditation, it does highlight that gap.
Thomas and then Lord Mayor.
In regard to fingerprints and digital forensics, the police have a huge responsibility. What is done to bring to the attention of the public the fact that there's a deficiency in accreditation? Why aren't you accountable to tell people that there's a shocking state of affairs?
All of the organisations that are accredited, that information is in the public domain and what they're accredited for.
But that isn't the question I asked. What do you do to bring to the attention of the public that certain police forces in vitally important areas like fingerprinting and digital forensics aren't accredited?
I think probably nothing specifically by ourselves, but we work very closely with the Forensic Science Regulator to look at what are the reasons the services haven't come forward, what are the delays, is there anything that we can do to raise awareness, to provide appropriate support and information to those services, because we all want that positive outcome to pull them through the process.
So really it's a question for the police and the Forensic Science Regulator, not for you.
And the court.
I think more significantly for them, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Lord Mayor, maybe you've answered some of us.
I've got a question. I think it's been answered already.
Okay. Lord Renfrew.
Yes, thank you. Concerns have been expressed and written evidence that the standards, the ICO 17025 and 17022 standards, are not particularly well suited to the forensic science discipline, and particularly to digital forensics. And would there be benefits in developing standards that are particularly relevant to forensic science?
The first thing for us to say is we don't hold the view that the standards 17025 or 17020 aren't appropriate and fit for purpose for those areas. I think when the standards are applied in new areas, there is a need sometimes to provide interpretation of those requirements. But those requirements are that the organisation has in place a management system, defined policies, processes, competent staff, suitable equipment, suitable reporting mechanisms and appropriate methods. And I find it hard to understand why those requirements wouldn't be seen as appropriate for those areas. But I think we do understand that the application of those generic requirements does sometimes need interpretation. And then if we then look at the process for accreditation is not just the standard, it's the use of peers, other experts to interpret those generic requirements and apply those to understand how competent, or to understand the competence of the organisation. So I don't think it's not our view that we need more standards that are used to evaluate the competence of those organisations carrying out those activities, not at all. In fact, we've got a body of evidence. We've conducted over 60 assessments in the area of digital forensics now, and the sorts of findings that we're identifying in relation to lack of validation, staff in the organisation not being aware of the limitations of methods and so on. There's a very long list of things. It's hard to understand why that wouldn't be seen as appropriate.
Lord Fox.
My experience with quality systems is that quality systems work when you can lock down the process. And that's obviously how manufacturing has moved over the years, is you have a process, you refine the process, you lock it down, and then you ensure quality through ensuring there's the process. Now, I can see how that works in some cases. So, for example, DNA testing would be a very good example where that works. But it would seem to me that the vast majority of the sorts of stuff that you seem to be talking about doesn't fit that process. So you come back to the point is you then have to accredit the people who are doing it, because you can't accredit the process as such. So that system, 17.0, whatever it is, doesn't appear to me to be accrediting people. So how can you ensure the quality through what you're doing? I don't see how it works.
There's a number of things that we can do when we're looking at more interpretive...
You do?
We do.
Okay.
Things we do when we're looking at aspects that are more interpretive, perhaps, or have an element of a slight more expertise required to them than DNA processing, where they might be more procedural.
It's the process,
yeah.
Yes, I understand.
So certainly there would still be a procedure that would be required, but it might give a bit more flexibility in that procedure to allow for the expertise of the individuals. But the rider to that then is the records maintained by the individual undertaking that examination, therefore need to be a bit more detailed perhaps to account for what they have done in that examination. So it might be that there are some examinations where the procedure allows for flexibility but records are increased. That will allow the organisation to review what the experts have done and make sure that their processes, including perhaps peer review of their processes, can look at the suitability of the approach taken by the experts.
By necessity, that would almost be after they've done it. So it will be after the evidence has been... It's a sort of post-delivery.
We mentioned previously
assessment.
the competence aspects of making sure that people put into those positions of undertaking the interpretive aspects would have their competence reviewed with that in mind. So there would be a number of checks and balances in the training and competence assessments to make sure that those people would be appropriate to be given that flexibility, if you like, to undertake that activity. So there'd be that check and balance at the beginning of the process to make sure the people were competent, the process defining the principles and the process, and the record keeping to indicate what actually has been done that then can be audited or reviewed, and we certainly would check all of those parts of that process as part of our assessments, and also witness people doing those activities and suggest to them, have a lot of interviews with staff around what would happen if this were to happen, or what would happen, to explore around the process itself in different ways.
All right, thank you.
Lord Renfrew, did you want to come back to any part of your question?
Well, I'd like to hear a little more about the specific application to digital forensics and what we are just talking about. That would be very helpful.
In terms of the competence of the practitioners, I mean, that would be an element that we would look at, the competence to determine what are the questions being asked of an examination, what is the best way to undertake that examination, what combination of tools, software tools will be used as part of that examination. And so we would look at the processes associated with that in terms of the individual's competence to undertake that, and understand limitations perhaps of some of those tools in relation to particular extractions or implementation, and make sure that they understood those limitations as well and applied them appropriately.
But more particularly, are the standards that are particularly applicable to digital forensics that could be further defined and explored?
If the sector itself feels that there's a need for the development of further standards, that sort of process standards, procedural standards, like we see in other areas of testing, there might be sort of defined methods that sit in either the national or international standards system. I think that's really for the market itself to decide. We don't believe that there is a gap in terms of a competence standard for the organisations that undertake digital forensics, whether they're small organisations or large. I think we've got a body of evidence and we can share that evidence with the committee in terms of the outcome from the large number of assessments that we've done that indicate that it is changing things, that it is having an impact. And improving quality, which is the aim, the Forensic Science Regulator's aim, and I think probably all stakeholders would expect that high quality to be there.
I mean, in digital organisations also, we would, those who have applied for accreditation to the regulators' codes of practice, there are additional appendices relating specifically to digital activities which we would apply to those assessments, which might look specifically at things like validation, and we apply those where people have requested that assessment.
A quick question.
I want to follow up Lord Renfrew, really. I mean, we are at a period of some sciences are moving slower than other sciences. I mean, clearly, everything to do with digital is enormously fast. And the method, I just wondered whether the whole methodology that you're using is changing, for those areas which is digital. And I just sort of, you've given a methodology that applies everywhere, but sometimes there's a sudden extraordinary leap forward. And I mean, we've once heard from the Turing Institute this amazing sort of range of digital approaches to applying to psychology, medicine, natural sciences. I mean, we are in an extraordinary period, and I just wondered really, are you gripping this sort of dramatic change? I mean, public officials, I know, should never use the word revolutionary. Nothing is very too exciting because it upsets all sorts of people. But I mean, we are in an extraordinary time here, and I just wonder, are you allowed to go to as it were, reflect that in what you're doing?
We can build in and do build in.
But if you, as you alluded earlier on, if you're not currently accrediting for digital forensic and you're developing this, then you just need to say so.
Well, we are accrediting for digital forensics. I think we've got about 40
organisations.
40 organisations that are covered by accreditation. So it's an area we're working in. But they define their scope of activity. So they define the types of evaluations and tests. So if they want new ones, because technology is moving on, then those need to be added on. What we can do is award a flexible scope. So we look at their ability to access new technology and deploy new technology, and that's something which it's a challenge for them to do that, but we do have examples in fast moving areas, because although digital is today's fast moving area, we've seen it in DNA.
Sure.
So we have adapted what we're doing, but I think the challenge is greatest for the organisation themselves, because they have to demonstrate their competence to us, so they kind of have that in place when they come across our door. So it's the work that they have to do before they actually sort of interact with us that is the bigger challenge, I think.
Lord Fox, quick question.
Following on from fast moving, how will you accredit artificial intelligence systems? Because for two reasons. One, it may well be an algorithm in a black box which you're not allowed to see, and even if you could see it, you may not understand it because no one can. And how will you go about going forward? Because it won't be long before artificial intelligence systems are providing evidence. So what possible hope do we have of any accreditation for that?
I think we do. We recognise it will be a challenge for us. We're seeing AI and our algorithms being used in data interpretation in quite a lot of areas now in healthcare. So then we look at the validation and the ability to demonstrate consistent output. But yes, I think AI will pose some big challenges for us. So we need to work with all of the stakeholders, the right experts, to ensure that we've got the right approach to assessing that. But we've got a history in UKAS of designing and developing accreditation in new areas. We've been doing that for many years. So I'm confident that we've got a process that will give us the best chance of doing that, but we need to validate it.
Okay, Lord Baroness Young, last question.
You've been in a fairly unique position in that you see right across the spectrum of all the providers, both in police force and private sector providers. We've been hearing a lot about cuts, and so some of them have been met by increased productivity and efficiency. Some of them clearly haven't. In your opinion, is the Forensic Science Service improving or regressing at the moment?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think there's a lot of improvement seen where the organisations have come forward for accreditation, and as Katherine mentioned earlier, we've seen, and with the deadlines looming, we've seen greater engagement. We've seen shifts in culture towards embracing quality much more, but there is still quite a lot for that to continue. That still needs to continue. I think there are other pressures that probably fall out with our role in terms of the marketplace itself, which are particularly challenging for the sector. And I think that's where we don't have a great ability to influence, other than report back what we are seeing in general terms for the organisations that come forward and are assessed by us.
So would you say, in summary, was the market a good thing or a bad thing?
I think there's always been a market in forensic science, and I mean, we had the Forensic Science Service previously, but there was always commercial provision as well. So I think there was just a switch perhaps to some of that commercial provision, taking over some of the responsibilities that the Forensic Science Service previously had, but then insourcing into police forces to sort of combat that, as it were. So there's still that mixed economy still going forward, as has always been the case. So accreditation can apply to all of those industries quite well and happily, so we can accredit in that facility.
I didn't think that was the question I was asking. No. I was asking whether, in your professional and technical opinion, you thought the services had got better or worse over the last 3 or 4 years.
We've seen an increased number of organisations gain accreditation, so I think in terms of improving quality, then yes, because we've seen those improvements, but we see the pressures as well in the market, and it's a difficult one for us to answer because we're providing that assurance around the quality and the competence of those organisations rather than the configuration. I think what we would say, though, is there's a need to remain quite steadfast over the standards and the quality. So however the market is configured, you can have confidence in the outcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. We've given you a good run for your money, I think, or our money, but sure. Thank you indeed. We're very grateful to you. If you have any things that you suddenly think that you might have liked to said, please feel free to send it in, and we record it as a written evidence. So thank you for today. We'll close the
proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The